The bullet missed Willa Winters by less than an inch, and she didn't even flinch as it splintered the fence post beside her head. She kept her eyes fixed on the cattle rustlers riding hard across her land, her father's old rifle steady in her grip, despite the tremor running through her arms from exhaustion and hunger she'd never admit to feeling. It was 1883 in Oro Blanco, Arizona Territory, and pride was about the only thing she had left that hadn't been taken, sold, or destroyed. She fired back, the recoil jolting through her shoulder, and watched with grim satisfaction as one of the men's hats flew off. They weren't expecting a lone woman to shoot back, much less with any accuracy. Her father had taught her well before the fever took him 6 months ago, leaving her with 200 acres of struggling ranch land, 40 head of cattle that were now 35, and debts that grew faster than the mesquite in summer. The riders disappeared over the ridge, and Willa finally lowered the rifle, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She'd been up since before dawn trying to repair the fence line they'd cut 2 nights running, working on nothing but black coffee and the same stale biscuits she'd been rationing for the past week. Her last ranch hand had left 3 weeks ago when she could no longer pay him, and the bank had sent another letter she'd burned without reading because she already knew what it said. She was 22 years old and losing everything her family had built over 2 generations, but she'd be damned if she'd ask anyone in town for help. They already whispered about her enough, the Winters girl trying to run a ranch alone, too stubborn to sell out to Raymond Kent, who'd been making offers since the day after her father's funeral. Too stubborn to marry one of the local men who'd suddenly discovered an interest in courting her now that she came with property. Never mind that they'd never given her a second glance before. Willa walked back toward the ranch house, a modest structure that needed a new roof and fresh paint she couldn't afford. The barn was in worse shape, and she'd been sleeping there some nights when it got too quiet in the house, when the memories of her father's laughter and her mother's singing became too much to bear. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, a fact her father had never blamed her for, but one she'd carried anyway. She was halfway to the house when she saw the horse tied to her porch rail, a magnificent black stallion that looked too well-bred for these parts. Her grip tightened on the rifle as she approached, eyes scanning for the rider. She found him sitting on her porch steps like he owned the place, hat tipped back, long legs stretched out in front of him. Raymond Kent stood as she approached, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He was tall, probably 6 feet and change, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the sky right before a storm. He'd shown up in Oro Blanco about 8 months back, bought the old Morrison place that nobody thought would ever sell, and proceeded to turn it into one of the most successful ranches in the territory. People said he'd made his money up in Montana, though doing what exactly remained a mystery he didn't care to clarify. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel under wagon wheels. "Heard shooting." "Nothing I couldn't handle," Willa replied, stopping a good 10 feet away from him. She didn't lower the rifle. He glanced at the weapon, then back at her face. Those were the same men who have been hitting the ranches along the creek. They got Patterson 2 days ago, made off with a dozen head before he could get organized. "They got 5 of mine before I sent them running," she said, lifting her chin. She wasn't about to admit that 5 head might as well be 50 given her current situation. Raymond's eyes moved over her, and she was suddenly, painfully aware of how she must look. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, hanging in tangles around her face. Her shirt was torn at the shoulder from where she'd caught it on barbed wire that morning. She'd lost enough weight that her clothes hung loose, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "You need help," he said, and there was no question in it, just flat statement. Her spine went rigid. "I need you off my property. I could send some of my men over, help you repair that fence line properly. Maybe bunk here for a few nights until these rustlers move on. I don't need your charity, Mr. Kent. It's not charity, it's being neighborly. Is that what you call trying to buy my land for half what it's worth? Being neighborly." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with the frustration and fear she kept bottled up inside. Something flickered across his face, might have been hurt if she thought a man like Raymond Kent capable of such things. "That offer was fair market value, and you know it. This land is running you into the ground." "Then I'll go into the ground with it," she said, "but it'll be mine when I do." He stared at her for a long moment, jaw working like he was chewing over words he wanted to say but knew better than to voice. Finally, he settled his hat lower on his head and stepped off the porch. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said. "Good thing your opinion doesn't feed my cattle or fix my fences." He paused beside his horse, one hand on the saddle horn. "Those men will be back. They always come back. Then I'll shoot straighter next time." Raymond swung up into the saddle with an ease that spoke of a lifetime on horseback. He looked down at her from that height, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Frustration, certainly, but something else underneath it. "Your father was a good man," he said quietly. "He wouldn't want you killing yourself over dirt and cattle." The mention of her father hit harder than she expected, and she had to lock her knees to keep from swaying. "You didn't know my father." "I knew him well enough. He used to come by the Morrison place before I bought it, back when old Tom still owned it. We'd talk sometimes about the land, about ranching. He mentioned his daughter a few times." Raymond gathered his reins. "Said you were smart as a whip and twice as tough, but he also said you had too much pride for your own good." Willa's throat tightened. "If you're trying to manipulate me by invoking my father's memory, you can save your breath." "I'm trying to help you," he said, and there was an edge of frustration in his voice now. "Though damned if I know why when you make it so difficult. I didn't ask for your help." "No, you'd rather starve than ask anyone for anything, wouldn't you?" The words hit too close to home. Her stomach was cramping with hunger, and she'd been dizzy on and off all morning, but she kept her face impassive. "What I would rather do is none of your concern." Raymond's hands tightened on the reins and his horse shifted beneath him, sensing his rider's tension. "Fine. When they come back and you can't hold them off alone, don't expect me to come running." "I won't," she said coldly. He rode off without another word, and Willa stood there watching until he disappeared down the long drive. Only then did she let herself sag, the rifle suddenly too heavy to hold. She made it to the porch steps before her legs gave out, and she sat down hard, pressing her forehead against her knees. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. The garden had failed in the drought, and she'd sold most of her chickens to pay the feed bill. She'd been living on coffee and whatever she could scrape together, telling herself she'd eat better once she sold some cattle at market next month, assuming she had any cattle left by then. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she'd had the energy to appreciate it. Instead, she forced herself to stand and go inside, where she'd check the locks on the doors and windows, load her father's other rifle and place it by the bed, and try to sleep, despite knowing the rustlers would likely return. She didn't sleep much. Every sound had her reaching for the rifle, every coyote howl making her wonder if it was a signal between thieves. By the time dawn broke, she was exhausted and edgy, nerves frayed to nothing. The day passed in a blur of necessary tasks. She checked on the cattle, finding them bunched nervously in the north pasture. She worked on the fence, though her hands were clumsy with fatigue and she dropped the hammer twice. Around noon, she made herself eat one of the remaining biscuits, washing it down with water from the well because she was out of coffee. She was measuring out wire when she heard the riders coming. Multiple horses, moving fast. Her heart kicked into high gear as she grabbed the rifle and ran for higher ground, a small rise that would give her a better vantage point. There were 6 of them this time, more than before. They'd brought reinforcements and they weren't bothering with stealth. They rode straight for her cattle, whooping and firing pistols in the air to scatter the herd. Willa brought the rifle to her shoulder and fired, but her hands were shaking badly now from exhaustion and poor aim betrayed her. The shot went wide. She worked the lever, fired again. One of the men yelped and grabbed his arm, but it wasn't enough to stop them. They were going to take everything. All of her remaining cattle, her last hope of making enough money to survive another season. She fired again and again, but there were too many of them and only one of her. Then she heard more hoofbeats, coming from the east. Her heart sank, thinking it was more rustlers, but these riders came in tight formation, and they were shooting with far better accuracy than she'd managed. The rustlers scattered, suddenly finding themselves caught between Willa's position and the new arrivals. One of the new riders broke away from the group, charging straight at the rustlers' leader. Even from a distance, she recognized Raymond Kent's black stallion, recognized the way he sat the saddle like he'd been born on horseback. He had a rifle in his hands, and he was using it with deadly precision, firing and working the lever in smooth, practiced motions. The fight was over in minutes. 2 of the rustlers were wounded. 3 more had their hands up in surrender, and one had managed to escape but was riding hard for the hills. Raymond's men rounded them up efficiently while Raymond himself rode up the rise to where Willa still stood, rifle hanging loose in her hands. "Thought you weren't coming," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. He dismounted, and she could see the anger in the tight line of his jaw, the flash in his gray eyes. "I said don't expect me. Didn't say I wouldn't come. I didn't ask you to." "No, you'd rather get yourself killed than ask for help." He took a step closer, and she could smell horse and gunpowder and something that was just him. "Do you have any idea how foolish you're being? 6 armed men against one woman who looks like she hasn't eaten in a week." "That's an exaggeration." "Is it?" He reached out, and before she could step back, he'd caught her wrist. His thumb pressed against her pulse point, and she knew he could feel how fast her heart was racing, how weak she'd become. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" She jerked her hand back. "That's none of your business." "The hell it isn't. You're my neighbor, whether you like it or not, and I'm not going to stand by and watch you work yourself to death out of sheer stubbornness. You don't get to make that choice for me." "Then make a better choice yourself." His voice softened slightly, though the intensity didn't leave his eyes. "Let me help you." "Why?" The word burst out of her, raw and desperate. "Why do you care what happens to me or my land?" Something shifted in his expression, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. "Because I've been where you are, not the same circumstances, but close enough. I know what it's like to be proud and desperate and convinced you have to do everything alone. And I know it nearly killed me before I learned better." She wanted to argue, wanted to send him away, but the fight had drained out of her along with the last of her energy. The world tilted sideways, and she felt herself falling. Raymond caught her before she hit the ground, his arms strong and steady around her. She tried to push away, but she had nothing left, no strength to resist as he lifted her easily. "Put me down," she said, but it came out as barely a whisper. "Not a chance." He carried her down the rise toward where his men were securing the rustlers. "Tom, ride into town and fetch Doc Morrison. Tell him to come out to the Winters place immediately." "I don't need a doctor," Willa protested weakly. "You need a doctor, food, and about 3 days of sleep in that order." He settled her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady. "Don't argue. You don't have the strength for it, and I don't have the patience." She should have been furious at his high-handedness, but she was too tired. Instead, she found herself leaning back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her spine. He was warm and solid, and for the first time in months, she felt almost safe. Raymond gave orders to his men, telling them to gather the scattered cattle and post guards on the Winters property. Then he rode toward the ranch house, keeping his pace smooth so as not to jostle her too much. "This doesn't change anything," she said as they approached the house. "I'm not selling my land to you. Didn't ask you to," he replied. "Though we are going to have a serious conversation about your situation once you've eaten and rested." He dismounted and lifted her down, then carried her up the porch steps and into the house. The interior was neat but sparse, furniture worn but well-maintained. He set her down on a chair at the kitchen table and began rummaging through her cupboards. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Finding you something to eat." He opened cabinet after cabinet, and she watched his expression grow darker as he took in the bare shelves. Finally, he turned to face her, and there was something almost like fear in his eyes. "Willa, there's nothing here. No food, no coffee, nothing." She looked away, shame burning in her chest. "I was going to go into town tomorrow, get supplies." "With what money?" When she didn't answer, he swore under his breath. "Stay here." He went outside, and she heard him talking to one of his men. A few minutes later, he came back carrying saddlebags which he deposited on the table. From them, he pulled bread, cheese, dried beef, apples, and a canteen of water. "Eat," he said, setting it all in front of her. Pride warred with hunger, and hunger won. She reached for the bread with shaking hands, tore off a piece, and nearly sobbed at the taste of it. Raymond watched her for a moment, then turned away, busying himself with building up the fire in the stove. She forced herself to eat slowly, knowing if she gorged herself after going so long with so little, she'd just be sick. But it was hard when every bite tasted like heaven, when her body was screaming for more. Raymond heated water for tea, found cups that were at least clean if chipped, and sat down across from her. He didn't speak, just watched her eat with an expression that was hard to read. "Thank you," she finally said, the words sticking in her throat but necessary. He nodded. "How long has it been like this? Does it matter?" "Yes," she sighed, setting down the bread. "The bank called in my father's debts 2 months after he died. I've been trying to pay them down, but between that and keeping the ranch running and feeding the hands, there wasn't much left over. When I had to let the hands go, I figured I could manage on my own if I was careful. Careful is one thing. Starving yourself is another. I wasn't starving. I was rationing. That's a pretty word for the same thing." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "How much do you owe the bank? I'm not telling you that." "Willa, no." She met his eyes firmly, despite her exhaustion. "I appreciate the help today and the food, but I'm not taking charity, and I'm not letting you pay my debts so you can hold them over me later." "Is that what you think I'd do?" "I don't know what you'd do. I don't know you." That seemed to hit him harder than she'd expected. He sat back, jaw tight. "You're right. You don't know me. So let me tell you something about myself. I grew up in Montana Territory, working cattle drives from the time I was 13. My father drank away everything we had, and my mother worked herself into an early grave trying to hold things together. I learned young that pride is expensive and asking for help isn't weakness." Willa listened, seeing him in a different light. "What happened?" "I left home at 16, worked whatever jobs I could find. Saved every penny, Learned everything I could about ranching and horses and land management. By the time I was 25, I had enough to buy my own place. The Morrison Ranch was struggling. Tom was getting old and had no family to leave it to. I made him an offer that let him retire comfortably, and I got land I could build something on. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand that I know what it's like to struggle. And I know that sometimes accepting help isn't giving up, it's giving yourself a chance to survive long enough to succeed. He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. Let me help you, Willa, not by buying your land, but by being a neighbor. Let my men help repair your fences and watch for rustlers. Let me stake you for supplies until you can sell your cattle at market. You can pay me back then, with interest if it makes you feel better. It was tempting, so tempting it frightened her. But the practical part of her brain, the part that had been running calculations for months, knew she couldn't survive alone much longer. If the rustlers came back in force, if another disaster struck, she'd lose everything anyway. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do this? Raymond's eyes held hers, and there was something intense in his gaze that made her heart skip. Because watching you struggle alone when I could help is driving me half mad. Because you deserve better than to lose everything your family built just because you're too proud to ask for help. And because, he trailed off, seeming to reconsider his words. Because what? Because I care what happens to you, he finished quietly. More than I probably should, given that you can barely stand to be in the same room as me. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, hoofbeats announced the arrival of Doc Morrison, an older man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Raymond let him in, and the doctor took one look at Willa and shook his head. "Young lady, what have you been doing to yourself?" "Just working hard, doctor. Working yourself to death, more like." He set down his medical bag and began examining her, checking her pulse, her eyes, listening to her heart. "You're severely undernourished and exhausted. You need rest, proper meals, and absolutely no strenuous activity for at least a week." "I can't do that. I have a ranch to run." "You have neighbors who can help," Raymond said firmly. "Doctor's orders trump your stubbornness." Doc Morrison looked between them with interest, a small smile playing at his lips. "I'll leave some tonic to help build up your strength, but the best medicine is going to be food and rest." "Can I count on you to make sure she gets both, Mr. Kent?" "You can, doctor." After Doc Morrison left, with a promise to check on her in a few days, Willa found herself alone with Raymond again. The sun was setting, painting long shadows across the kitchen floor. "I should go," Raymond said, standing, "but I'll have some of my men bunk in your barn tonight, keep watch, and I'll be back tomorrow with supplies." "Raymond." She stopped him as he reached the door, and it was the first time she'd used his given name. He turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Thank you for everything today." Something softened in his expression. "You're welcome. Now get some rest. Real rest in a bed, not keeping watch all night with a rifle." After he left, Willa did as he'd instructed, climbing the stairs to her bedroom for the first time in days. She fell asleep almost instantly, and for the first time in months, she didn't wake at every sound. She woke late the next morning to the sound of hammering. Disoriented, she went to the window and saw a crew of men working on her barn roof, others stringing new wire along the fence line. In the midst of it all, directing operations from horseback, was Raymond. She dressed quickly and went outside, stopping when she reached him. He saw her and dismounted, his expression almost defensive, like he expected her to argue. "I know you didn't ask for this," he said before she could speak. "But it needed doing, and I had the men available." She looked around at all the activity at her ranch being set right for the first time in months and felt something crack in her chest. Tears stung her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. "Hey," Raymond said softly, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." She pressed her hands to her face, trying to compose herself. "I've been so scared for so long, and I wouldn't let anyone see it. I kept thinking if I could just hold on a little longer, work a little harder, I could fix everything on my own." "You don't have to do it alone," he said, and his hand came up to gently pull her hands away from her face. "You never had to." She looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw concern in his eyes and kindness and something that might have been affection. "I don't know how to not do it alone. I've been on my own since my father died. Then let me teach you." His thumbs brushed over her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "Let me help you, Willa, not because you can't do it yourself, but because you shouldn't have to." The walls she'd built around herself, the armor of pride and stubbornness, began to crumble. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and saw relief flood his face. Over the following days, Raymond was true to his word. He brought supplies, restocked her pantry, and had his men complete repairs that had been needed for months. More than that, he taught her better ways to manage her resources, shared his knowledge of breeding and land management, treated her like a partner rather than someone to be rescued. They worked side by side often, and Willa found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice. The way he was patient with the horses, firm but kind with his men. The way he'd show her a technique rather than just doing it for her, respecting her need to be capable even as he helped lighten her burden. She noticed other things too. The way his eyes would seek her out across the yard, how he always seemed to know when she needed water or a break. The small smile that crossed his face when she successfully completed a difficult task. 2 weeks after the rustler attack, as they were working together to gentle a new horse she'd acquired in trade, Willa realized with startling clarity that she was beginning to care for Raymond Kent as more than just a helpful neighbor. The realization came when the horse shied, and Raymond's arm shot out to steady her, pulling her back against his chest to keep her out of harm's way. She could feel his heart pounding, felt the strength in the arm wrapped around her waist, and when she turned her head to thank him, their faces were suddenly inches apart. Time seemed to stop. His eyes dropped to her lips, and she saw the exact moment he realized what he was doing and forced himself to step back. "Sorry," he said roughly. "Didn't mean to grab you like that. You were keeping me from getting kicked. I'd say that's allowed." She tried to keep her voice light, but it came out breathless. They finished with the horse in silence, the air between them charged with something new and electric. When they were done, Raymond walked her back to the house, keeping a careful distance that felt both respectful and frustrating. "There's a social coming up in town next Saturday," he said as they reached her porch. "I was wondering if you might like to attend, with me." Her heart kicked into a faster rhythm. "Are you asking me to accompany you, Mr. Kent?" "I am, Miss Winters, if you're willing." She thought about how it would look, showing up to the social with Raymond Kent, how the gossips would talk. Then she thought about how little she cared what they said, how much she'd come to enjoy Raymond's company. "I'd like that," she said. The smile that crossed his face was worth every bit of gossip she'd endure. "I'll pick you up at 6, if that suits." The week leading up to the social passed in a pleasant blur. The ranch was running more smoothly than it had in months, and Willa found herself humming while she worked, something she hadn't done since before her father died. She spent more time than was probably necessary deciding what to wear, finally settling on a blue dress her mother had made years ago that she'd kept carefully preserved. It needed taking in, as she'd lost so much weight, and she spent an evening with needle and thread making the alterations. Saturday arrived warm and clear. She bathed and dressed with care, pinning her dark hair up in a style she hoped looked elegant rather than simply practical. When she heard Raymond's wagon pull up, her stomach fluttered with nerves. She opened the door before he could knock and stopped short at the sight of him. He'd cleaned up remarkably well, trading his usual work clothes for dark trousers and a vest, a clean white shirt that made his sun-bronzed skin stand out. His hair was neatly combed, and he held his hat in his hands. "You look beautiful," he said, the words simple but sincere. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, then blushed at her own boldness. He helped her into the wagon, his hand warm and steady on hers, and they set off toward town. The ride was comfortable, conversation flowing easily as they talked about the ranch, the cattle, plans for the fall. Oro Blanco was small but bustling, the main street lined with businesses that served the surrounding ranches and the few remaining mining operations. The social was being held in the town hall, and they could hear music already playing as they approached. Raymond helped her down from the wagon, and Willa took a deep breath before entering on his arm. The room fell quiet for a moment as people noticed them together, and she saw more than a few surprised faces. Let them look, she thought, lifting her chin. Raymond guided her to the refreshment table, then stayed close as people began approaching to greet them. Most were friendly enough, though Willa caught the speculative glances, heard the whispered conversations. "Pay them no mind," Raymond said quietly. "They're just surprised to see the Ice Queen thawing." She looked at him sharply. "Is that what they call me?" among other things. Most of them complimentary, some less so. "You've built quite a reputation for being unapproachable." "Good, kept the vultures from circling." He laughed at that, a warm sound that made her smile. "Dance with me." She let him lead her onto the floor, where other couples were already moving to a waltz. His hand settled at her waist, and she placed hers on his shoulder, letting him guide her into the steps. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer," she said as they began to move. "You're doing fine." His gray eyes were warm as they looked down at her. "Just follow my lead." They moved together surprisingly well, finding a rhythm that felt natural. Willa was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, the way his fingers held hers, the small distance between their bodies that somehow felt both too much and not enough. "People are staring," she murmured. "Let them. I'm proud to be here with you." The words made warmth bloom in her chest, and she found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name, but was beginning to recognize as more than simple gratitude or friendship. They danced several more dances, and between them, Raymond introduced her to some of his business contacts, men who might be interested in buying her cattle at fair prices. He did it subtly, weaving it into natural conversation, giving her the opportunity without making it seem like charity. As the evening wore on, Willa realized she was having more fun than she'd had in years. It wasn't just the music or the company, though both were pleasant. It was the feeling of being part of things again, of not being alone against the world. Later, as Raymond was getting them both punch, Tom Patterson approached her. He was an older rancher, one who'd known her father. "Good to see you looking well, Willa," he said kindly. "Your pa would be glad to know you've got Raymond Kent looking out for you. He's a good man, even if he is a bit of a mystery." "What do you mean?" she asked, curious. Tom glanced around, then leaned in conspiratorially. "Well, nobody knows much about where he came from or how he made his money. Some say he was a lawman up in Montana. Others say he made a fortune in gold. All I know is he showed up here with enough money to buy the Morrison place outright, and he's been nothing but fair and honest in his dealings since." Raymond returned with their drinks before she could ask more, and Tom excused himself with a knowing wink. She filed the information away to think about later. As the evening wound down, Raymond drove her home under a sky full of stars. The air was cool and pleasant, and Willa found herself reluctant for the night to end. "I had a wonderful time," she said as they pulled up to her house. "Thank you for inviting me. The pleasure was mine." He climbed down and came around to help her, but instead of just offering his hand, he placed both hands on her waist and lifted her down. For a moment they stood very close, the moonlight casting shadows across his face. "Willa," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He seemed to struggle with the words, his hand still resting lightly on her waist. "When I first came to Oro Blanco, I had no intention of settling down permanently. I thought I'd build up the ranch, maybe sell it in a few years and move on. But then I met you, and everything changed." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Changed how?" "I found myself wanting to stay, wanting to build something permanent. And when your father died and I saw you trying to manage everything alone, saw how proud and stubborn and determined you were, I knew I was in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" He lifted one hand, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes flutter closed. "The kind where I can't stop thinking about you. Where every day I find excuses to ride by your property just to catch a glimpse of you. Where the thought of you struggling alone drives me half mad with the need to help, to protect, to be near you." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "Raymond, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I know this is sudden, and I know you've been through a lot. I just wanted you to know how I feel, so you'd understand that my help isn't about pity or wanting your land. It's about caring for you more than I've ever cared for anyone." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Willa felt her own walls crumbling completely, the last of her resistance melting away in the face of his sincerity. "It's not sudden," she said quietly. "Or maybe it is, but it doesn't feel that way. I've been noticing you too, Raymond, the way you are with the horses, with your men. The way you never made me feel weak for needing help, just human. I think I've been falling for you without even realizing it." Hope flared in his eyes. "Willa, I'm scared," she admitted. "Of letting someone in, of depending on anyone, of what it might mean if things don't work out." "I'm scared too," he said. "But I think what scares me more is the thought of not taking this chance, of walking away from something that could be extraordinary because we're both too afraid to risk it." She reached up, covering his hand with hers where it still rested against her cheek. "I don't want you to walk away." "Then I won't." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but she didn't want that at all. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a question and a promise all at once. Willa melted into the kiss, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, and she felt something inside her settle, like a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing had finally clicked into place. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Raymond rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably go," he said, though he made no move to step back. "Probably," she agreed, equally reluctant to let the moment end. "But I'll be back tomorrow, and the day after that. And every day you'll have me." "That might be a lot of days," she warned. He smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I'm counting on it." He kissed her once more, brief and sweet, then forced himself to step back. She watched him climb into the wagon, watched him drive away, and stood on her porch long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, her fingers pressed to her lips. The next weeks passed in a haze of happiness Willa had never expected to feel. Raymond was true to his word, coming by almost daily to help with the ranch work, but also simply to spend time with her. They'd ride out to check the fence lines together, talking about everything and nothing. He'd stay for dinner, and she'd cook meals that actually filled the table, grateful for the supplies he'd brought and the hunting he did to supplement them. They went on picnics to the creek, and Raymond taught her to fish, laughing when she shrieked at catching her first one. They'd sit under the cottonwood trees, and he'd tell her stories about his time in Montana, gradually filling in the gaps of his past. "I was a deputy marshal for a few years," he admitted one afternoon as they sat by the water. "Made good money, saved most of it. But the work was dangerous and I saw too many men die young. When I had enough saved, I quit and came south, looking for a place to settle. Why Oro Blanco? The land was good, the price was right, and it was far enough from Montana that my past wouldn't follow me." He glanced at her. "I wasn't running from the law or anything like that, just from memories of things I'd had to do as a lawman." She reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I'm glad you came here. So am I." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Best decision I ever made." As summer gave way to fall, the time came to take the cattle to market. Raymond insisted on going with her, bringing several of his hands to help drive the combined herds. The drive to the railroad town took 3 days, and Willa had never felt so proud as when she negotiated a fair price for her cattle, with Raymond standing supportively nearby but letting her handle the business herself. The money she made was enough to pay off her father's debts in full, with enough left over to stock up on supplies for winter and make necessary improvements to the ranch. As she walked out of the bank, deed free and clear in her hands, she felt tears prick her eyes. Raymond was waiting outside, leaning against the hitching post. When he saw her expression, he straightened. "Everything all right, better than all right." She held up the deed. "It's mine. Really, truly mine. No debts, no liens, nothing." His face broke into a huge smile, and he swept her up in his arms, spinning her around right there on the main street of a town where people were staring. She didn't care. She wrapped her arms around his neck and laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he set her down, he kept his arms around her waist. "I'm so proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have. It might have taken longer, but you'd have found a way. You're the strongest person I know, Willa Winters." She kissed him, there in front of God and everyone, and heard more than a few gasps from passers-by. Let them talk, she thought. She'd found something real and good, and she wasn't going to hide it. That night, as they camped with the men on the way back to Oro Blanco, Raymond asked her to take a walk with him. They strolled away from the fire, up a small rise where they could see the stars spread out above them like diamonds on velvet. "Willa," he said, taking both her hands in his. "I know we haven't been courting long by conventional standards, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life than I am about this, about us." Her heart started racing as he dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I love you," he said, and his voice was steady despite the intensity in his eyes. "I love your strength and your stubbornness and your pride. I love how you never give up, how you face every challenge head on. I love the way you laugh when you think no one's listening, and the way you get that little line between your eyebrows when you're concentrating. I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, building something together, facing whatever comes as partners. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling so hard it almost hurt. "Yes, yes, Raymond, I'll marry you." He stood and kissed her, lifting her off her feet as he spun her around again. She laughed against his lips, tasting salt from her tears and feeling joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. They returned to camp hand in hand, and when the men saw their expressions, a cheer went up. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey they'd been saving, and toasts were made to the happy couple. The wedding was held 6 weeks later in the small church in Oro Blanco. Willa wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved all these years, altered to fit her frame. Raymond wore a new suit ordered special from San Francisco, and when they joined hands at the altar, Willa felt her father's presence like a blessing. The whole town turned out, filling the church to capacity. Even those who'd gossiped about her when she was struggling alone seemed genuinely happy for her now, and Willa felt the last of her bitterness fade away. She'd survived, and more than that, she'd found love in the process. The reception was held at Raymond's ranch, which was now their ranch, she supposed, though they'd decided to keep both properties running. There was dancing and food and more toasts than could possibly be healthy, and through it all, Raymond never left her side. As evening fell and their guests began to depart, Raymond led her away from the festivities to the house he'd prepared for them. He'd added a second story, created a master bedroom with large windows that overlooked the valley. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kent," he said as he carried her over the threshold. She kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope for the future into it. "Take me to bed, husband." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left them both breathless and amazed. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the windows, Willa traced patterns on Raymond's chest. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted quietly. "After my father died, I thought I was destined to be alone, to just survive day by day until I couldn't anymore." He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "You were never going to fail, Willa. You're too stubborn for that. But I'm grateful every day that I got to be part of your success, that you let me in despite how hard it was for you. You didn't really give me much choice," she said with a smile. "You were too stubborn to let me suffer. And you were too proud to ask for help. We're quite a pair." "We are," she agreed, settling against his chest. "And I wouldn't change a thing." The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. They combined their herds and their resources, making both ranches more profitable. Willa discovered she had a talent for breeding horses, and under her care, their stable grew with quality animals that fetched top prices. Raymond taught her more advanced riding techniques, and they'd spend hours working with the horses together, moving in tandem with an understanding that went beyond words. At night, they'd sit on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, and plan for the future. In the spring of their second year together, Willa realized her monthly bleeding hadn't come. She waited another month to be sure before riding into town to see Doc Morrison, who confirmed what she'd suspected. "You're with child, Mrs. Kent," he said with a smile. "I'd say about 3 months along." She rode home in a daze of joy and terror. She'd never really thought about children, had been too focused on survival for so long. But now, the idea of a baby, of Raymond's child, filled her with a fierce, protective love she hadn't known she was capable of. Raymond was in the barn when she got home, working with a particularly stubborn colt. She stood in the doorway watching him, this man who'd changed her entire life, and felt tears prick her eyes. He looked up and saw her, and concern immediately crossed his face. He left the colt and came to her, hands gentle on her shoulders. "What's wrong? What did the doctor say?" "Nothing's wrong," she said, smiling through her tears. "Everything's right. Raymond, I'm pregnant." For a moment he just stared at her, processing the information. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she'd ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down, concern replacing joy. "I'm sorry, should I not have done that? Are you all right? Do you need to sit down?" She laughed at his sudden nervousness. "I'm fine. I'm pregnant, not fragile. Still, you should take it easy. No more working with the difficult horses, and definitely no more climbing on the barn roof to fix shingles. Raymond, I'm not going to become helpless just because I'm carrying a baby. I know. But let me worry about you anyway. It's my job as your husband. They went into the house, and he made her sit down while he fixed her tea and fussed over her in a way that would have been annoying if it wasn't so endearing. That night, as they lay in bed, his hand rested protectively over her still flat stomach. "Boy or girl, do you think?" he asked. "Does it matter? Not even a little bit. I'll love them regardless." "Good answer." He kissed her shoulder. "Thank you, Willa, for everything. For taking a chance on me, for building this life together, for giving me a family. I never thought I'd have this." She turned in his arms to face him. "Neither did I. But I'm so glad we found it together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Raymond's worrying increased proportionally with her belly. He insisted she do less and less of the ranch work, despite her protests, until finally she gave in and accepted that he was going to be overprotective whether she liked it or not. Their son was born on a cold January night in 1886, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. Raymond refused to leave her side, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement even when she cursed at him and told him this was all his fault. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and screaming his displeasure at being forced into the cold world, Willa felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. Raymond's face was wet with tears as Doc Morrison placed the baby in his arms. "A son," the doctor said with satisfaction. "A healthy, strong son." They named him William after Willa's father. He had Raymond's gray eyes and Willa's dark hair, and from the moment he entered their lives, he had both his parents wrapped around his tiny fingers. Willa discovered that motherhood came more naturally than she'd feared. She nursed the baby and changed him and walked the floors with him when he was fussy, and through it all, Raymond was right there beside her, learning alongside her. "We have no idea what we're doing, do we?" she said one night as they both stood over the cradle, watching William sleep. "Not a clue," Raymond agreed cheerfully, "but we'll figure it out together." As William grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. They hired more hands, built a larger barn, and expanded their operations. Willa's horse breeding program was becoming known throughout the territory, and Raymond's cattle were sought after for their quality. When William was 2, Willa found herself pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder, and she spent the last 2 months confined mostly to bed rest. Their daughter, Charlotte, was born in early spring, smaller than William had been but equally healthy. Raymond held both his children in his arms that day, William toddling at his feet. Baby Charlotte nestled against his chest, and Willa thought she'd never seen him happier. "Our family," he said, looking at her with such love it made her chest ache. "Our family," she agreed. The years passed quickly, filled with the chaos and joy of raising children and running ranches. William grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with the horses like his mother. Charlotte was sunny and fearless, following her father everywhere, insisting she was going to be a rancher when she grew up. In 1890, when William was 4 and Charlotte 2, they received news that the Homestead Act modifications were bringing more settlers to the territory. Some ranchers worried about overcrowding, but Raymond saw opportunity. "We should buy more land," he said one night as they reviewed the ranch books. "The Peterson place to the south is for sale. If we bought it, we'd control the entire creek, ensure water rights for years to come." "That's a big investment," Willa said, though she was already calculating the numbers. "It is, but we're in a position to make it, and I think in 20 years we'll be glad we did." They bought the Peterson place and another smaller property to the east, growing their holdings to over 1,500 acres. It meant more work, more hands to hire, more responsibility. But it also meant security for their children and their children's children. One evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch watching William and Charlotte chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Willa leaned against Raymond's shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever think about those early days?" she asked. "When I was barely surviving, too proud to ask anyone for help." "Sometimes," he admitted. "Mostly I remember how frustrated I was, watching you struggle alone, knowing you'd bite my head off if I tried to help. I was pretty fierce, wasn't I? You still are, just in different ways now." He kissed the top of her head. "I'm glad I was too stubborn to give up on you, and I'm glad I was finally too desperate to keep refusing help." She turned to look up at him. "Though I prefer to think of it as accepting partnership rather than accepting help," he smiled. "Call it whatever you want. I call it the best thing that ever happened to me." In 1893, when William was 7 and Charlotte 5, Willa found herself pregnant once more, much to everyone's surprise. This pregnancy was the easiest of the three, and their second son, Thomas, was born in early fall, a chubby, happy baby who seemed to find joy in everything. "3 children," Raymond said, cradling Thomas while their older children peered at their new brother with fascination. "We've been blessed, Willa." "We have," she agreed, watching her family with a full heart. The children grew, and the ranch grew with them. William showed a natural talent for business alongside his love of horses, and by the time he was 15, he was handling sales negotiations with ranchers twice his age. Charlotte remained fearless and was the best rider in the family, able to stay on horses that threw everyone else. Thomas developed his father's patient way with animals and his mother's stubborn determination. In 1898, Arizona territory was changing rapidly. The railroad had expanded, bringing more people and more opportunities. Oro Blanco had grown from a small settlement to a proper town with schools, churches, and businesses. Raymond and Willa had grown too, their hair showing threads of silver, lines of experience marking their faces. But the love between them had only deepened, weathering the challenges and celebrating the triumphs together. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Raymond took Willa back to the creek where they'd had their first picnic all those years ago. The cottonwood trees had grown taller, and the water still ran clear and cool. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" he asked as they sat on a blanket, holding hands like newlyweds. "I remember thinking you were the most frustrating man I'd ever met," she said with a smile. "And now I think you're the most frustrating man I've ever met, but you're my frustrating man, and I wouldn't have it any other way." He laughed and pulled her close. "I love you, Willa Kent. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "Where did you hear that?" "Made it up just now." "I'm a romantic." She kissed him, tasting happiness and history and hope. "Yes, you are." As the new century approached, the Kent family was firmly established as one of the most successful ranching operations in southern Arizona. Their land was prosperous, their cattle and horses highly sought after, and their children were growing into capable, confident adults. William, now 19, had started courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a smart young woman named Sarah who could ride as well as any man and wasn't afraid of hard work. Willa approved heartily and suspected a wedding was in the near future. Charlotte, at 17, had declared she was going to college in San Francisco to study veterinary medicine, shocking everyone but her parents, who had long since learned that their daughter would forge her own path regardless of convention. Thomas, at 12, was still finding his way but showed promise in both ranching and academics. One evening, as Willa and Raymond sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "I almost lost everything," she said quietly. "If you hadn't been too stubborn to let me suffer, if I hadn't finally swallowed my pride enough to accept help, I'd have lost the ranch, probably my life." "You'd have found a way," Raymond said firmly. "You always do. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out. I'm glad I had you." He squeezed her hand. "We've built something good here, haven't we? Not just the ranch, but our family, our life. We have. And it's all because you saw someone who needed help and refused to walk away, even when that someone was too proud to admit they needed it. And because you were brave enough to accept help when it was offered, even though it went against every stubborn instinct you have." She smiled. "We're quite a pair." "The best pair," he agreed. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear one by one, Willa thought about the young woman she'd been, alone and desperate and too proud to ask for help. That woman felt like someone from another lifetime now. She thought about Raymond, the man who'd been too stubborn to let her suffer, who'd forced his way past her defenses not with aggression but with kindness and persistence and genuine care. Their story could have ended so differently. She could have lost everything. He could have given up on her. But instead they'd found each other, built something lasting and true. "What are you thinking about?" Raymond asked, noticing her distant expression. "Just how lucky we are," she said. "How a few different choices, a little more pride or a little less stubbornness, and we might have missed this entirely. But we didn't miss it. We're here together with our children and our land and our future ahead of us." "Our future," she repeated, liking the sound of it. "What do you think it holds?" "More of this," he said, gesturing to encompass the ranch, their home, their life. "More family, more challenges, more triumphs. William will marry Sarah and they'll give us grandchildren. Charlotte will become a veterinarian and probably come back to revolutionize ranching in the territory. Thomas will find his path, and we'll be here, watching it all unfold together." "That sounds perfect," Willa said, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence as night settled around them, the sounds of the ranch a familiar symphony. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Closer, they could hear William talking to the horses as he did his final check of the stable, Charlotte's laughter floating from the house where she was helping Thomas with his schoolwork. This was home. This was family. This was love that had grown from the ashes of desperation and pride, nurtured by stubbornness and care into something stronger than either of them alone. "Raymond," Willa said softly. "Yes, love, thank you, for not giving up on me. For being stubborn enough to help even when I fought you every step of the way. For seeing something in me worth saving." He turned to her, his gray eyes soft in the starlight. "I wasn't saving you, Willa. I was just refusing to let you fight alone. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. You saved yourself. I just made sure you had the resources to do it." She thought about that, about the fine line between being saved and being supported, and decided he was right. She'd done the work, made the hard choices, fought the battles. But she'd done it with a partner by her side, and that had made all the difference. Years continued to pass, marked by weddings and births, and the steady rhythm of ranch life. William married Sarah in a ceremony that brought together families from all over the territory. Charlotte did indeed become a veterinarian, the first woman in Arizona Territory to do so, and returned home to apply her knowledge to improving their breeding programs. Thomas eventually discovered a love for land management and took over expanding their operations into new areas. Raymond and Willa grew older together, silver turning to white in their hair, hands growing weathered but never losing the habit of reaching for each other. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their family tree spread and grow. The ranch that Willa had nearly lost became the foundation for a legacy that would last generations. The Kent name became synonymous with quality and integrity in ranching circles throughout the Southwest. But more than the material success, more than the acres and cattle and reputation, was the love story that had started it all. The story of a woman too proud to ask for help and a man too stubborn to let her suffer, who found in each other not just salvation but partnership, not just survival but joy. On a warm summer evening in 1920, Raymond and Willa celebrated their 37th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The party was held at the original ranch house, the one Willa's father had built, now restored and maintained as a family home. As the celebration wound down and family members began departing, Raymond took Willa's hand and led her out to the porch where so much of their life had been lived. "Tired?" he asked, settling into the rocking chair they'd bought years ago, pulling her down to sit beside him. "A little," she admitted, "but happy tired." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the same sounds they'd listened to for nearly 4 decades together. "I was thinking about the day we met," Raymond said. "Really met, I mean, not just passing in town. The day you had your rifle pointed at those rustlers, looking fierce and terrified all at once." Willa smiled at the memory. "I was certain I was going to lose everything that day. The cattle, the ranch, maybe my life. Instead, you gained everything. We gained everything. Because you were too stubborn to let me suffer alone. And because you were brave enough to let someone in, despite your pride." She turned to look at him, this man who had been her partner through all the years, all the challenges and triumphs. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were the same stormy gray that had captured her heart all those years ago. "I love you," she said simply. "Then, now, always." "And I love you," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "My stubborn, proud, brave Willa." As the stars came out above them, just as they had on countless nights before, Willa reflected on the path that had brought them here. The struggles that had nearly broken her, the pride that had almost been her downfall, the stubbornness that had saved them both. She thought about the young woman she'd been, alone and desperate in a world that seemed determined to defeat her. She thought about the man who'd refused to let that happen, who'd fought past her defenses with patience and persistence and love. Their story wasn't one of rescue or salvation. It was a story of partnership, of 2 strong people recognizing strength in each other and choosing to build something together rather than standing alone. It was a story of pride learning to bend, of stubbornness finding purpose, of love growing in the most unlikely circumstances. It was their story, and it was far from over. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, hearts beating in tandem after all these years, both Raymond and Willa knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. Because she had learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, and he had learned that offering it wasn't presumption. Together, they had built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and land and family that would continue for generations to come. The Wild West they had known was changing, becoming more civilized, more settled. But the fundamental truths they had discovered remained the same. Love could grow in harsh soil. Stubbornness could be a virtue when applied correctly. Pride was acceptable as long as it didn't prevent you from accepting the help you needed. And sometimes, the best things in life came from the collision of 2 equally strong wills. 2 people who challenged each other to be better, to do more, to build something greater than either could have achieved alone. As the moon rose over the Arizona landscape they had tamed together, Raymond and Willa Kent sat in perfect contentment, knowing that their love story, which had begun with a woman too proud to ask for help and a man too stubborn to let her suffer, had become something timeless and true. Their ranch would continue. Their children would carry on their legacy, and their love, forged in the fires of struggle and strengthened by years of partnership, would remain as the foundation upon which everything else was built. It was a good life, a full life, a life worth living. And it all started because someone cared enough to be stubborn, and someone else was brave enough to let them.